In the autumn of 1903, when gaslight still flickered against the prairie darkness and coal smoke drifted lazily from chimneys across the Iowa landscape, the small town of Van Meter slumbered beneath star-filled skies as it had for decades. This community of barely 400 souls nestled against the rolling countryside like amber jewels scattered across black velvet, each window glowing with the warm light of kerosene lamps that pushed back the vast darkness of the American heartland. Van Meter was a working town, built on coal mining and agriculture, where time moved to the rhythm of pickaxes striking seams deep beneath the earth and church bells that carried across miles of cornfields. Main Street stretched like a dusty ribbon through the heart of the community, lined with false-fronted buildings. Mather and Greg's General Store, the first national bank with its sturdy brick construction, Dr. Alcott's modest practice, and O.V. White's hardware store where farmers and miners purchased the tools that built their lives. The air carried the distinctive perfume of frontier life, with smoke curling from dozens of chimneys, the earthy scent of coal dust, the sweet smell of hay from the livery stable. At night, when the last lamp was extinguished, the town settled into the profound quiet that only rural communities knew, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the occasional bark of a dog alerting the darkness to some perceived threat. That it was in this peaceful, predictable world that something impossible began to stir. Something that would shatter the comfortable assumptions of good, church-going folk and leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about the natural order of creation. The first sighting came on October 2, 1903, when U.G. Griffith, the cashier at First National Bank, was making his way home after a long day of ledgers and transactions. Griffith was a man of precise habits and unshakable reliability, whose word was accepted without question by everyone in town. He had stayed late that evening to balance the books, ensuring every penny was accounted for before morning. As Griffith stepped into the cool October air, he checked his pocket watch by streetlight, 8:47 p.m., a detail he would remember with absolute clarity for the rest of his life. He began his usual walk home, footsteps echoing softly on the wooden boardwalk. The familiar sounds of the settling town surrounded him, the creak of wooden signs swaying in the breeze, distant piano music from the hotel, soft murmur of conversation from the general store. But then something changed. A shadow passed overhead, too large and too swift to be any earthly bird, casting momentary darkness that seemed to swallow the lamplight itself. Griffith looked up, expecting perhaps a large owl, but what he witnessed instead would haunt his dreams for years to come. Silhouetted against the star-filled sky was a creature of impossible proportions, its wingspan stretching at least 8 feet from tip to tip, its body larger than any earthly bird had a right to be. The thing's wings moved with slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic. But most disturbing was the light emanating from what appeared to be its head, a brilliant, pulsing glow that cast eerie shadows on the buildings below as the creature passed overhead. The light was not the warm yellow of gaslight or flickering orange of flame, but something cold and alien, a blue-white radiance that seemed to pierce through darkness with unnatural intensity. The creature circled the town once, twice, 3 times, its glowing beacon sweeping across rooftops like a malevolent lighthouse searching for unknown landmarks. Then, with movements almost too graceful for something so large, it descended toward the business district and alighted upon the roof of the Mather and Gregg building. From his position on the street, Griffith could see the creature's form outlined against the night sky, perched like some prehistoric gargoyle come to life. The glow from its head illuminated wooden shingles and cast long, dancing shadows that writhed with their own life. For several minutes, man and creature regarded each other across the gulf of impossibility that separated their worlds. Griffith felt paralyzed by terror and fascination, unable to flee yet unwilling to draw closer. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the being spread its massive wings and launched back into the night sky, disappearing beyond the town limits. The next evening brought no respite from the growing terror that would soon grip Van Meter. Dr. Alcott, perhaps the most respected citizen in town, had been summoned to attend Mrs. Henderson's fever when he encountered the impossible on Cedar Street. As he turned the corner, Dr. Alcott became aware of unusual brightness ahead. At first assuming it might be a barn fire, he soon realized the illumination was moving in patterns unlike anything terrestrial flames could produce. The light pulsed and swept back and forth across rooftops, casting shifting shadows that danced across walls and windows. When Dr. Alcott looked up to identify the source, He found himself staring at something that challenged every principle of natural history he had studied. Hovering 30 feet above the street was a creature of extraordinary size and alien appearance, its massive wings beating slowly as it maintained position in the night air. The thing's body appeared roughly humanoid but covered in dark, leathery skin that gleamed dully in light emanating from its own head. The creature's most remarkable feature was the brilliant beacon projecting from what appeared to be a horn on its skull. This organic searchlight swept back and forth across the town below, so intense it left afterimages burned into Dr. Alcott's vision when he blinked. The illumination cast shadows that seemed somehow wrong, as if the light followed different laws of physics than earthly radiance. As the doctor watched in fascination and growing horror, the creature's beacon fixed upon him, bathing him in that cold, alien radiance. For a moment that stretched into eternity, man and monster regarded each other across the impossible gulf separating their species. The creature's wings, which Dr. Alcott estimated spanned at least 10 feet, were unlike those of any bat or bird. Thick, leathery membranes stretched between elongated fingers ending in curved talons. Then the smell reached him, a sulphurous reek that burned his nostrils and made his eyes water. It was the smell of brimstone, of coal seams burning deep underground, of chemistry experiments gone wrong in some hellish laboratory. The odor coated his mouth and throat, leaving a metallic taste that lingered long after the creature moved on. Without warning, the being emitted a sound that would haunt Dr. Alcott forever. It was not the screech of any earthly animal, but something combining the shriek of tearing metal with the wail of a tormented soul. The sound was so loud it seemed to vibrate through his bones, making his teeth ache and ears ring. Windows rattled, dogs throughout town began howling, and horses in the livery stable reared in terror as echoes of that terrible cry faded. The creature wheeled around and glided toward the business district, settling once again upon the Mather and Gregg building. From this perch, it continued sweeping its beacon across town, as if conducting aerial survey of the human settlement below. On the third night, O.V. White, proprietor of the town's hardware store, added his testimony to the growing collection of impossible encounters. White had remained late to complete inventory when unusual brightness began seeping through his front windows. Setting down his ledger, he peered through the plate glass window displaying his wares. What he saw defied every assumption about the natural world. Perched directly atop his building was a creature larger than he had expected from whispered accounts, its enormous talons gripping wooden shingles with enough force to crack the underlying boards. The thing was roughly the size of a full-grown man but possessed anatomical features belonging to no earthly taxonomy. The creature's wings, folded against its body, were clearly designed for powered flight. When it shifted position, White could hear the creak and rustle of those wings adjusting balance, a sound like old leather being stretched. But the creature's head commanded his terrified attention. Protruding from its skull was a horn blazing with internal light, casting a brilliant cone of illumination so bright White had to squint to look directly at it. As White watched from inside his store, the creature's head turned slowly, its luminous horn sweeping across town like a lighthouse beacon. When the beam fixed on his front window, flooding the interior with that cold, penetrating light, man and monster regarded each other through the barrier of glass in rational disbelief. The creature's body appeared covered in dark, mottled hide that gleamed wetly in light from its own beacon. When it shifted weight, White could see powerful muscles beneath alien flesh, suggesting physical strength far beyond any known flying creature. Without warning, the thing opened what could only be its mouth and released a sound that shattered the peaceful night air. The cry was so loud it seemed to bypass his ears entirely, vibrating through his bones until his heart skipped beats in rhythm with the terrible sound. His store window vibrated so violently White feared it might shatter. The creature's call was answered from elsewhere in town, another voice, equally inhuman but different in pitch, suggesting Van Meter hosted more than one impossible visitor. Miss Sarah Collins, the local schoolteacher, added her own educated testimony when she encountered the creature during her evening walk home. Miss Collins was a woman of refinement who had studied natural history and prided herself on rational thinking. Her account carried particular weight because of her systematic approach to observation. Walking along Elm Street after staying late to prepare lessons, she became aware of unusual brightness approaching from the western sky. As the light drew closer, she realized it was moving in patterns unlike any earthly conveyance, rising and falling, circling and hovering, responding to no visible control. When the source finally came into view, Miss Collins found herself facing the same impossible creature terrorizing other residents. The thing descended until it hovered barely 20 feet above the street, massive wings beating slowly. The sound was like thunder rolling across the prairie, creating downdrafts that rattled wooden shingles. The creature's beacon illuminated her with such intensity she could see her own shadow cast sharply behind her. Despite her terror, Miss Collins forced herself to note specific details. The creature's body was roughly 6 feet long, covered in dark, leathery skin glistening with moisture. Its limbs ended in curved talons capable of gripping prey with devastating effectiveness. The wings were most remarkable, enormous membranes stretched between finger-like supports, measuring at least 10 feet tip to tip. The wing structure was clearly designed for powered flight, with visible muscle groups bunching and relaxing as the creature maintained its hovering position. The membrane itself appeared semi-transparent, revealing a network of vessels that pulsed with faint luminescence. The creature seemed to study her with the same intensity she was observing it. Though she could not make out specific facial features in the brilliant glare, she had the distinct impression that intelligent eyes were examining her, cataloging her appearance and behavior with scientific precision. The sensation was profoundly unsettling. By the fourth night, terror-gripping Van Meter had reached fever pitch. The sightings were no longer isolated incidents but part of a pattern suggesting the town was under otherworldly surveillance. Families kept children indoors after dark, farmers brought livestock into barns earlier than usual, and even skeptical residents found themselves glancing nervously at the sky as evening approached. Led by U.G. Griffith and O.V. White, a group of armed men gathered at the hardware store to plan their response. The group included Dr. Alcott with his medical bag and hunting rifle, several local farmers with shotguns, the town marshal with his service revolver, and nearly a dozen other men who had grown tired of cowering while something inexplicable terrorized their community. White's hardware store became an impromptu armory as men selected weapons and ammunition for their confrontation with the impossible. The smell of gun oil and kerosene mingled with the sulfurous reek that seemed to linger around buildings where the creature had perched, creating an atmosphere of impending conflict as darkness fell. The armed men took positions throughout town. Some concealed themselves behind water troughs and wooden fences, others crouched in doorways and alleyways. A few positioned themselves on rooftops for clearer shots at flying targets. Van Meter's normally peaceful streets took on the appearance of a battlefield. They did not wait long. The creatures appeared earlier than usual that night and in greater numbers than previously observed. Instead of the single light characterizing earlier sightings, multiple beacons could be seen approaching from different directions. The creatures came in formation, their lights weaving together in patterns suggesting coordination beyond human understanding. The lead creature, larger than the others with a beacon blazing more brilliantly, descended toward its familiar perch atop the Mather and Gregg building. But instead of settling immediately, it hovered while other creatures took positions on various buildings throughout the business district. The entire downtown area was bathed in alien radiance, creating a nightmarish tableau of shadows and light. Griffith was first to open fire. His rifle cracked in the night air, muzzle flash briefly illuminating his determined face as he sent a bullet toward the nearest creature. The shot appeared to strike its target. The creature lurched slightly and emitted a sound part shriek, part roar, combining pain with outrage at this unprecedented attack. The creature's cry was immediately answered by its companions, their voices joining in a chorus of alien fury that shattered windows throughout the business district and sent terrified horses rearing. But instead of attacking their human tormentors, the creature seemed to communicate through complex vocalizations that rose and fell in patterns suggesting language rather than mere animal cries. White, positioned on his store roof with clear view of the creature perched above, took careful aim with his shotgun and fired both barrels. The double blast lit up the night like lightning, heavy shots striking the creature with enough force to stagger it. Pieces of what looked like dark flesh scattered in the air, and the creature's beacon flickered momentarily as if seriously wounded. But victory was short-lived. Within seconds, the creature had recovered and fixed its beacon directly on White's position, bathing him in light so intense it seemed to burn his exposed skin. Through the painful glare, he could make out the creature's form as it spread enormous wings and launched toward his position with obvious hostile intent. White rolled away just as massive talons raked through the space where he'd been crouching, gouging deep furrows in wooden shingles. The creature's wing beats created powerful downdrafts that threatened to knock him off the roof entirely, while the sulfur smell was so overwhelming he gasped and choked. Dr. Alcott, witnessing White's peril, raised his rifle and fired at the attacking creature. His bullet struck what appeared to be its torso, eliciting another terrible shriek and causing it to break off its attack. But like Griffith's earlier shot, the bullet seemed to cause only temporary discomfort rather than serious injury. Other defenders opened fire as creatures swooped and circled overhead, the night air filled with rifle cracks and shotgun booms. Muzzle flashes lit up darkness like fireflies, and gunpowder's acrid smell mingled with the creature's sulfurous reek. But their weapons, effective against earthly predators, seemed to have little lasting effect on the otherworldly visitors. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably no more than 30 minutes. The creatures demonstrated abilities defying every assumption humans held about the natural world. They felt no fatigue despite constant maneuvering. Their beacons never dimmed except when taking direct hits, and their coordination remained flawless even as bullets flew around them. But as the first pale hints of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, the creature's behavior changed. Their attacks ceased abruptly, and they regrouped above the business district in tight formation, suggesting strategic withdrawal. Their beacons swept the town one final time. Then they wheeled around and flew westward toward the rolling hills bordering Van Meter's agricultural lands. It was Griffith who proposed tracking the creatures to their lair. If they could not kill the beings in open combat, they might discover where they went during daylight hours and find some way to deal with them while presumably vulnerable. Dr. Alcott, despite his scientific training and natural caution, found himself supporting the plan. The trail led them through farmland and pastures, past abandoned homesteads where prairie was slowly reclaiming what humans had briefly conquered. They found evidence of the being's passage in strangest places, patches of grass scorched as if by intense heat, livestock huddling in far corners of fields, and oppressive silence blanketing the countryside wherever creatures had passed. The trail led inexorably toward the old brick and tile works, an abandoned industrial site shuttered years earlier when local clay deposits proved insufficient for profitable operations. The facility consisted of crumbling buildings and a deep shaft sunk into the earth to extract clay beneath the prairie soil. Most locals avoided the area, considering it dangerous due to unstable buildings and the unmarked pit dropping into unknown depths. As the search party approached, signs of the creature's presence became unmistakable. The sulfurous smell grew stronger with each step until it coated their throats and burned their nostrils. Grass around the buildings was blackened and withered, as if exposed to radiation that had drained life from every growing thing. But it was the shaft itself that commanded their horrified attention. The old clay pit, which records indicated descended approximately 40 feet, now glowed with faint phosphorescent light seeming to emanate from depths far greater than any earthly excavation should reach. The illumination pulsed rhythmically, like a massive heartbeat deep beneath Iowa soil. Griffith was first to approach the pit's edge, his practical nature overcoming natural caution as he peered into the glowing depths. What he saw would haunt him for the remainder of his days. A shaft descending not 40 feet but hundreds, perhaps thousands of feet into the earth, its walls lined with phosphorescent substance providing eerie illumination. And moving within those depths were forms that could only be more creatures. "There are dozens of them," Griffith whispered, his voice barely audible above strange harmonics rising from the pit like vast organ notes too low for human ears to properly detect. "Maybe hundreds. They're everywhere down there." The shaft appeared to be not simple excavation but a complex tunnel system branching and diverging as it descended into Earth's depths. The creatures moved through these passages with confidence of beings in their natural habitat, their bioluminescent bodies creating moving constellations against phosphorescent walls. Dr. Alcott noted that the creatures existed in complex social structure. Larger beings, presumably adults, moved with purpose through central passages, while smaller forms clustered inside tunnels branching off from the main shaft. White voiced what they were all thinking. "We can't fight them down there. There are too many, and we'd be fighting on their ground." As evening approached, activity in the pit increased. The phosphorescent glow grew brighter, and creature movement became more frequent and purposeful. But then something unexpected happened. As darkness fell, two creatures emerged from the depths, one large adult and a smaller, clearly juvenile companion. The watching humans realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. What appeared to be a training flight, with an adult instructing a younger one in surface observation techniques. The larger being would demonstrate particular maneuvers, and the smaller would attempt replication, sometimes requiring correction and additional instruction. This otherworldly education revealed that they were dealing with intelligent beings possessing their own culture, methods of passing knowledge between generations, and social structures paralleling human society while remaining utterly alien. The realization was both fascinating and terrifying. The training flight continued for several hours, during which the adult demonstrated techniques for aerial reconnaissance, surface landing, and evaluating potential threats. As dawn approached, both creatures returned to the pit, descending into those glowing depths with fluid grace. The sightings continued for several more nights, but with different character than before. The aggressive behavior was replaced by cautious observation, as if the battle had taught the beings that humans were capable of organized resistance. The adult continued bringing juveniles to the surface, using Van Meter as a training ground. As October drew to a close, the visitations decreased in frequency. The creatures still emerged, but less often and for shorter periods, as if whatever purpose had driven them to the surface was being completed. The final sighting occurred on Halloween night, 1903. The entire colony emerged from the pit, filling the sky above the abandoned brick and tile works with phosphorescent forms and alien beacons. They circled in complex patterns suggesting ritual or ceremony, their voices joining in harmonies that carried across miles of prairie. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished. The creatures descended into their underground realm and were not seen again. The phosphorescent glow faded from the pit, the sulfurous smell dissipated, and normal prairie sounds gradually returned. Van Meter settled back into quiet routine, but the town was forever changed by its encounter with the impossible. The witnesses found their lives altered in profound ways, and the story of the Van Meter visitor became local folklore passed down through generations. The abandoned pit remained, eventually sealed by authorities fearing curious children might fall into its depths. But those who had witnessed the creature's emergence knew the tunnels and chambers beneath Iowa soil remained, waiting in darkness for purposes human minds could not comprehend. Years passed, decades turned into a century, and the world changed in ways 1903 citizens could never have imagined. But beneath the Iowa prairie, in depths no earthly excavation had ever reached, something continued to wait. The Van Meter visitor had returned to whatever realm spawned it, but the tunnels remained. Sometimes, on quiet nights when wind was still and stars bright, those who knew where to listen could hear sounds rising from the earth, sounds suggesting movement, intelligence, and perhaps preparation for another emergence into the world above. The creatures had demonstrated patience spanning geological ages, intelligence adapting to changing circumstances, and purposes remaining as mysterious as their origins. What had waited beneath the Iowa prairie for millennia could wait millennia more, biding time until conditions were right for another emergence. Another contact with the surface world that had grown and changed in unimaginable ways since they last walked beneath the stars.